Brenda, HOA president, crowned with a visor of pure entitlement, slapped a violation on my gate. Standing water, the notice declared, its ink already bleeding slightly in the humid July air, citing a puddle in my grandfather's century-old drainage ditch. A puddle. After a biblical deluge that had Noah checking his schematics. Fine. 500. Escalating daily by 50. A cruel little fiscal pulse. She'd actually smirked when she handed it to my bewildered wife Sarah earlier. Mosquito prevention, darling. We have standards. My grandfather. A man who diverted actual rivers for the Army Corps of Engineers, who understood the language of water in ways Brenda couldn't comprehend if it was spelled out in flashing neon, would have wept. Or laughed until his ribs ached. I did neither. I simply took the damp paper, noted the aggressive serif font of Brenda's signature, and felt a cold, familiar calm settle over me. The kind of calm that precedes meticulously planned disassembly. My eyes drifted across my 5 acres, past the ancient oaks my grandfather had named, to the far property line, then indexed left, to where Brenda's ostentatious gazebo and her prize-winning, chemically dependent rose garden baked in the sun. She had just declared war on a ghost and his very pissed off, very well-trained grandson. You won't believe how this ends, but I assure you, every drop of it is true. The initial shock had given way to a quiet, simmering fury, the kind that doesn't boil over but instead forges steel. Sarah was incandescent with rage. A puddle? She's fining us for rain? After that storm? Is she insane? I just nodded, letting her vent. Her anger was a cleansing fire. Mine was a slow, burning ember, already calculating fuel loads and wind direction. The ditch in question wasn't some neglected sump. It was a carefully graded swale my grandfather had engineered 60 years ago to manage runoff from the upper part of our property, channeling it harmlessly towards the small, seasonal creek that bisected the back 40. It had worked flawlessly for decades, a testament to his foresight. Brenda, in her infinite wisdom and 3-year HOA presidency, had decided it was a public health menace. The standards she referred to were her own, freshly minted and selectively enforced. The truth was, Brenda Thorne lived for control. Her reign over Pleasant Valley Estates was a tapestry woven from petty grievances and draconian interpretations of bylaws written by people long since departed or sane. She patrolled the neighborhood in her golf cart, a miniature tyrant in pastel activewear, her eyes scanning for infractions. A rogue garden gnome, a slightly off-hue mailbox, the existential threat of an unedged lawn. Her own property, naturally, was a monument to artificial perfection, a sterile landscape of unnaturally green turf and rigidly pruned shrubbery. The roses were her particular pride, garish explosions of color that seemed to scream defiance at the surrounding natural woodland. The gazebo, a recent addition, was her throne room, where she held court with her equally odious vice president, a Weasley man named Gary, who echoed her every pronouncement. My first step was, of course, an appeal. I drafted a polite, fact-based letter, complete with historical context of the drainage ditch, rainfall data from the local weather station proving the recent extraordinary precipitation, and a gentle reminder of property rights. I even included a faded photograph of my grandfather, shovel in hand, proudly standing beside his newly dug swale. Sentimental, perhaps, but I wanted to establish that this wasn't just dirt and water, it was legacy. Brenda's reply, delivered via HOA letterhead so crisp it could draw blood, was a masterpiece of condescending dismissal. The board has reviewed your appeal. It stated the board being her, Gary, and a terrified retiree named Agnes who voted with Brenda to avoid fines on her own bird feeders. While we appreciate the historical anecdote, current regulations regarding vector control are paramount. The fine stands. Please remit payment within 7 days to avoid further penalties and potential liens. Anecdote. She called my grandfather's engineering an anecdote. That's when the ember in my chest flared, just a little. The cold calm remained, but now it had an edge, like a freshly honed blade. I knew then that reason was a foreign language to Brenda Thorne. She didn't want compliance, she wanted submission. and submission was not in my operational vocabulary. The next morning, another notice: unapproved ground cover. Apparently, the patch of native wildflowers my grandmother had painstakingly cultivated near the old wellhead, a vibrant splash of blues, yellows, and reds that attracted bees and butterflies, violated some obscure bylaw about uniform landscaping. Another 200 fine. This was no longer about a puddle. This was a siege. Sarah looked at me, her eyes wide. "What are we going to do? We can't afford this. She's going to fine us out of our own home." I put my arm around her. "No, she's not. She's made a strategic error. She's underestimated her opponent. And she'd insulted my grandmother's flowers. That was a declaration of total war." I spent the next evening in my grandfather's old workshop, a place that still smelled faintly of sawdust, oil, and pipe tobacco. His tools hung on the walls, organized with military precision. His drafting table, covered in a fine layer of dust, still held a faded blueprint for a small bridge he designed for a county park. This was my sanctuary, my think tank. I pulled out the original survey maps of our property, the ones with my grandfather's spidery annotations. I cross-referenced them with the county GIS portal, checking easements, setbacks, and water rights. The seasonal creek at the back of our property, a modest trickle in summer, a respectable flow in spring, was clearly marked. More importantly, its entire course, where it traversed our land, was well within our boundaries. And Brenda's gazebo, I noted with growing interest, was situated a mere 30 feet from our shared property line, downhill from a significant portion of my land. A plan began to form, audacious and beautifully simple. It would require precision, legal cover, and a certain amount of earth moving. It would also be, in its own quiet way, devastatingly effective. My cousin Leo was my first call. Leo was a GIS analyst for a state agency, but his real passion was amateur hydrology and a healthy dose of anti-establishmentarianism. He also owed me for that time I helped him retrieve his drone from the top of the town's water tower after a misguided attempt to document Masonic symbols. "Leo," I said, "I need a consult. Topographical analysis, water flow modeling, and a bit of creative engineering. And discretion. Lots of discretion." There was a pause, then Leo's voice crackling with enthusiasm. "Are we finally doing something about that HOA dragon lady? Because I've got theories, man. Theories about her funding. Reptilian overlords, probably." "Lay it on me." I explained the situation, the fines, Brenda's intransigence, the location of her gazebo relative to the creek and my property line. Leo was silent for a moment, the only sound the click of his keyboard. "Dude," he said finally, his voice tinged with awe, "you're thinking of rerouting Willow Creek?" "Not rerouting the entire creek, Leo. Just a slight course correction. On my land. Perfectly legal. A minor diversion, shall we say. 20 feet to the left, give or take." Leo started laughing. "Oh, this is beautiful. This is poetic. Her prize roses are about to get a serious drink. And the gazebo, does it have a foundation or is it just sitting on pavers?" "Pavers," I confirmed, a grim smile playing on my lips. She called Granddad's work an anecdote. "The woman is a Philistine," Leo declared. "Okay, send me your survey maps. I'll run some simulations. We need to ensure the new channel is stable, won't cause erosion on your side, and most importantly, directs maximum aesthetic moisture towards her assets." The next few days were a blur of meticulous planning. Leo, bless his conspiratorial heart, threw himself into the project with gusto. He sent me detailed topographical maps overlaid with flow projections. We discussed soil composition, optimal channel depth and width, and the best way to create a gentle, natural-looking bend that would direct the water exactly where we wanted it. Phase 1, reconnaissance, was complete. Phase 2, legal fortification, began. I spent hours at the county clerk's office, then with a laconic, elderly lawyer who specialized in land use and water rights. Mr. Abernathy had seen it all, and his only reaction to my plan was a slow blink and a muttered, Well, that's one way to water a rosebush. He confirmed what my research suggested. As long as the creek diversion occurred entirely on my property, didn't impede the overall downstream flow significantly, didn't flood anyone else, besides the intended target, whose gazebo was, strictly speaking, on her own land, and thus her own problem, if it got damp, and didn't violate any specific environmental protections for that section of the creek, I was in the clear. Willow Creek, in its current state on my land, was too small and intermittent to have significant protections beyond basic riparian decency, which I intended to uphold just slightly to the left. The beauty of it was that Brenda's own HOA bylaws were silent on the matter of creek rerouting within one's own property. They had rules for bird bath placement and acceptable shades of beige for siding, but nothing about minor hydrological engineering. An amusing oversight. I also filed for a simple earth-moving permit with the county, citing landscape improvement and erosion control. The description was vague enough to be innocuous, specific enough to be legal. It was approved within 48 hours. The trap was slowly, methodically being set. Brenda, meanwhile, continued her reign of terror, blissfully unaware. Another fine appeared. Improper refuse container placement. Apparently, my trash cans were 2 inches too far from the curb on collection day. The fines were now approaching $1,000. I paid them, not with a check, but with a money order, delivered by certified mail with return receipt requested. Each payment was a small, cold stone added to the foundation of my resolve. Sarah was worried, but seeing the meticulousness of my planning, the quiet confidence in my eyes, she began to trust. Just try not to get arrested, she'd said, half joking. Arrested for what? I'd replied. Improving my property's natural water features? The final piece of the puzzle was the equipment. I rented a mini excavator and a compact track loader, scheduling delivery for a Tuesday, a day Brenda usually spent at her regional President's Power Lunch with other aspiring despots. The rental company was instructed to drop them at the far end of my property, near the existing creek bed, shielded from view of Brenda's house by a thick stand of pine trees my grandfather had planted as a windbreak. Operation Gazebo Soak was ready to commence. The Tuesday arrived, cool and overcast, perfect weather for heavy work. The equipment was delivered as scheduled, 2 yellow beasts squatting patiently in the tall grass. Leo arrived shortly after, dressed in what he called his tactical gardening attire, cargo pants, steel-toed boots, and a hat with a built-in mosquito net. He was practically vibrating with excitement. "Today, my friend," he announced, slapping me on the back, "we make hydrology history, or at least HOA history." We walked the proposed new course, marked with small orange flags. It was a gentle arc, starting from a point upstream on my property, running parallel to the property line for about 100 feet, then curving back to rejoin the original creek bed just before it left my land. The critical section, the part that would pass within a whisper of Brenda's gazebo, was engineered with almost loving precision. "The gradient here is key," Leo explained, pointing to a stretch. "We want a consistent, gentle flow. Not a torrent, not a swamp, just a persistent, undeniable presence of water." We started the mini excavator. The diesel engine rumbled to life, a satisfying counterpoint to the chirping of birds. I took the controls, the levers familiar in my hands from past projects, a different kind of core, a different kind of engineering. The first scoop of earth came away cleanly. We worked steadily, methodically. Leo operated the track loader, moving excavated soil to reinforce the banks of the new channel and to create a subtle berm that would discourage the water from taking any shortcuts back to its old path. It was hard work, but deeply satisfying. Each movement of the earth felt like a small act of reclamation, a quiet assertion of rights long dormant. By midday, the new channel was largely complete, a dark, moist scar across the landscape, curving exactly as planned. We paused for lunch, sitting on the tailgate of my truck, watching the empty channel. "Moment of truth approaches," Leo said, munching on a sandwich. "You nervous?" "No," I said, And it was true. I felt a profound sense of inevitability, as if the land itself was correcting an imbalance. This wasn't just my plan, it felt like the landscape's desire. After lunch, we focused on the inlet and outlet. We carefully breached the bank of the existing creek at the upstream point, and then, with a strange sense of ceremony, removed the earthen dam at the head of our new channel. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, a dark tendril of water nosed its way into the freshly dug earth, hesitant at first, then gaining confidence. It trickled, then flowed, a silver ribbon unfurling across the land. We watched, transfixed, as the water made its way down the new course. It eddied around a strategically placed rock, gurgled over a small gravel bar Leo had artfully constructed, and then, with unerring accuracy, flowed directly along the path we had designed. It passed less than 5 feet from where we estimated the edge of Brenda's rose garden began, and then slipped silently into the shaded area beneath her gazebo's footprint. Perfection, Leo breathed, his eyes shining. Absolute, unadulterated, hydraulically sound perfection. We spent the rest of the afternoon tidying up, seeding the disturbed earth with a native grass mix, and ensuring the old creek bed was adequately blocked to encourage the water along its new adventure. By the time we finished, the new stream looked as if it had always been there, a natural, meandering watercourse. Except now, it was a watercourse with a mission. As the sun began to dip, casting long shadows, I stood at my property line, looking towards Brenda's domain. Her gazebo stood proud, its white paint gleaming. Her roses were, as yet, unaware of their impending hydration therapy. I felt no triumph, no malice, just a quiet satisfaction. The kind a craftsman feels when a complex piece of machinery clicks perfectly into place. I had simply rearranged the elements on my own land. The consequences, well, those were for Brenda to discover. And discover them she would. The following morning, I was enjoying a cup of coffee on my porch, the air still cool and smelling of damp earth and pine. The new creek gurgled contentedly in the distance. Sarah was humming in the kitchen, a lighter mood having settled over our house since Terraforming Tuesday, as Leo had dubbed it. Around 9 a.m., a shriek cut through the morning calm. A shriek of such pure, unadulterated outrage, it could have shattered glass. It was followed by a string of less articulate, but equally furious exclamations. Brenda had made the discovery. I took another sip of coffee. "Showtime," I murmured. Sarah came to the porch door, eyes wide. "Was that the Queen of Pleasant Valley, I presume?" I said, surveying her newly irrigated domain. We didn't have to wait long. Brenda's golf cart came tearing around the corner of her house, moving far faster than its design specifications probably allowed. It lurched to a halt at the edge of her lawn, perilously close to the now noticeably damp soil around her roses. She practically vaulted out, her face a mask of apoplectic fury, her pastel tracksuit already spattered with mud she hadn't noticed yet. "You!" she screamed, jabbing a finger in my direction from 50 yards away. "What have you done?" I remained seated, calmly observing. "Good morning, Brenda. Lovely day, isn't it? Seems we had a bit of unexpected water flow." "Unexpected? You dug a trench. There's a river flowing through my gazebo. My roses, they're drowning." Her voice was escalating into a register that likely disturbed bats. I stood up, walked slowly to the edge of my porch. "Brenda, I simply did some landscaping on my own property. Improved the drainage. That water is from the creek that, as you know, crosses my land." "Your land? You've diverted it? You've flooded me? This is illegal. I'm calling the police. I'm calling my lawyer. I'm calling everyone." She was sputtering, waving her arms. Her weaselly vice president, Gary, had now appeared, looking pale and alarmed. He was trying to peer under the gazebo, his shoes sinking into the soft earth. "The water is on your property, Brenda," I stated calmly. "What happens to it there is, strictly speaking, your concern. My work was confined entirely to my own land." As if on cue, a county sheriff's patrol car pulled up. Brenda must have called them the moment she saw the water. She rushed towards the deputy, a young man who looked like he'd rather be anywhere else. "Officer, arrest him! He's destroyed my property! He's created a hazardous flood zone!" The deputy listened patiently, then walked over to the property line. I met him there, survey map in hand. "Morning, officer," I said. "Just doing a bit of property improvement. Here are the survey lines and my permit for minor earthworks." The deputy looked at the map, looked at the new creek, looked at Brenda's now visibly soggy rose garden, and the water flowing placidly under her gazebo. He walked the line, peering at the markers. He knelt and looked at the water. "Well, ma'am," he said, turning back to Brenda, his voice carefully neutral, "the new channel appears to be entirely on his property, and he has a permit for the work. As far as the water flowing onto your land, that seems to be a civil matter. It's runoff from his property onto yours. Happens all the time with natural watercourses." Brenda's face went from puce to a startling shade of white. "Civil matter? It's vandalism. It's hydrological warfare." The deputy just shrugged, a classic, "not my circus, not my monkeys" gesture. "Unless he's actively projecting water onto your land with a pump, or has dammed it in a way that illegally floods you from a shared resource, there's not much we can do. It's a natural creek, and he's altered its course on his own land. You might want to talk to an engineer about drainage solutions on your side." He handed me back my map. "Looks like your paperwork is in order, sir. Try to keep the peace, folks." And with that, he got back in his car and drove away, leaving Brenda standing in stunned, spluttering silence. Gary was now trying to pull a wrought iron garden flamingo out of what was rapidly becoming a shallow pond around one of Brenda's prize rose bushes. The flamingo, it seemed, was sinking. My face remained impassive, but inside, a small, satisfied smile was taking root. The initial shockwave of Brenda's fury soon morphed into a determined, if clumsy, counteroffensive. Her lawyer, a slick city type whose suit looked out of place in Pleasant Valley, sent me a cease and desist letter filled with impressive-sounding legal jargon threatening injunctions, damages, and unspecified calamities. It accused me of maliciously altering riparian topography and willful infliction of hydrological distress. I passed it to Mr. Abernathy, who chuckled dryly. "Hydrological distress," he mused. "That's a new one. Sounds painful." His response was concise. My client had acted within his rights on his own property. All work was permitted, and any distress experienced by Miss Thorne's gazebo or flora was a consequence of her own property's topography and lack of adequate drainage for naturally occurring water flow from an adjacent, higher elevation parcel. Checkmate, legally speaking, for now. Brenda, however, was not one to be deterred by mere legality when her perceived authority was challenged. She tried to rally the HOA board, demanding they pass an emergency bylaw prohibiting creek diversions. Agnes, the terrified retiree, actually found a sliver of courage and pointed out that such a bylaw couldn't be retroactive and, besides, the creek wasn't HOA common property. Gary, of course, sided with Brenda, proposing they fine me for unapproved landscaping features of an aquatic nature. This was too much even for some of Brenda's usual supporters. The Millers, who lived down the street and had suffered under Brenda's reign of terror over the color of their window shutters, actually laughed out loud at that suggestion during an impromptu, socially distanced shouting match on Brenda's lawn. Brenda shouting, the Millers calmly pointing out facts from their own driveway. Meanwhile, nature, as it tends to do, was taking its course. The new creek channel began to naturalize rapidly. Ferns uncurled along its banks. Small water insects appeared. And then, one morning, Leo, who had taken to making inspection visits armed with a dip net and a pair of binoculars, called me, his voice electric. "You are not going to believe this. Get down here." I found him crouched by a deeper pool we'd inadvertently created near a small cascade. He held up a clear specimen jar. Inside, darting frantically, were 3 tiny silver-sided fish, no bigger than my pinky finger. "Brook trout," Leo breathed, reverence in his tone. "Native brook trout fingerlings. Salvelinus fontinalis. They must have washed down from further upstream, found the new channel. This water is clean. It's oxygenated. It's a habitat." An idea, far more potent than simply annoying Brenda, began to form. If this little creek, my little creek, could support native trout, it wasn't just a drainage ditch or a weapon in an HOA war. It was an ecosystem, a protected one. Leo, I said slowly, how does one go about getting a small emergent trout stream officially recognized, perhaps even certified? Leo's eyes lit up like he'd just discovered the lost city of Atlantis in his backyard. Oh, my friend, he said, rubbing his hands together. Now we're talking legacy. Now we're talking environmental stewardship. Brenda wanted to fight mosquitoes. We're going to give her a federally recognized biodiversity hotspot. The process of getting the creek recognized was surprisingly straightforward, if paper-intensive. I contacted the state's Department of Fish and Wildlife. A biologist named Dr. Evans, a woman with kind eyes and a no-nonsense demeanor, agreed to visit. She spent a morning on my property, taking water samples, measuring flow rates, and patiently identifying aquatic insects with Leo, who was in absolute heaven, bombarding her with questions. Dr. W. Kreezer. Evans was impressed. This is remarkable, she said, looking at the clear water flowing around a moss-covered rock. For such a small, recently altered channel to attract trout so quickly, it speaks to the health of the upstream watershed. And your landscaping, she added, with a slight knowing smile, has actually created excellent pool and riffle habitat. She explained that while individual certification for such a small stream was unusual, if it demonstrably supported a native trout population, it would fall under state and potentially federal protections regarding water quality and habitat disturbance. Basically, she concluded, if these little guys are here and thriving, this stream is now considered a valuable natural resource. Any activity that would negatively impact them or their habitat would be subject to significant scrutiny and likely prohibited. She promised to file a report and update the state's waterway classifications. The official designation, Class A cold water fishery, arrived a few weeks later on crisp government letterhead. It wasn't just my creek anymore. It was a recognized and therefore protected trout stream. I framed the certificate and hung it in my workshop, next to the photo of my grandfather. Brenda's reaction to this development was, predictably, volcanic. She found out when she tried to hire a landscaping company to build a berm on her side of the property line to block the water. The company, doing its due diligence, checked county records, and discovered the creek's new protected status. They informed Brenda that any work near the creek would require extensive permitting and environmental impact studies, and even then, altering the flow to the detriment of the aquatic life was likely impossible. She reportedly shrieked at the landscaper for a full 10 minutes before he packed up his equipment and left muttering about crazy HOA ladies. Her gazebo was now perpetually damp underneath. A faint, earthy smell of wet soil and decaying leaves emanated from it. Her prize roses closest to the creek were looking distinctly waterlogged, their lower leaves yellowing. Some had developed a rather fetching coat of mildew. She couldn't touch the creek. She couldn't alter its flow. She couldn't even technically get too close if her actions might disturb the riparian zone, which now, by default, extended a certain number of feet onto her property to protect the bank integrity. Her mosquito prevention crusade had ironically birthed a thriving aquatic ecosystem that she was now legally bound to preserve. The deliciousness of it was almost too much to bear. I took to spending evenings by the creek, not just for the satisfaction, but for the genuine peace it offered. The sound of the water, the sight of sunlight dappling through the leaves onto the flowing current, was profoundly calming. Sometimes, if I sat still enough, I'd see the quick flash of a small trout darting for cover. My grandfather would have approved. He knew water was life. Brenda, it seemed, was only just beginning to learn that lesson, the hard way. The news of the protected trout stream of Pleasant Valley, as Leo dramatically called it, spread through the neighborhood like wildfire. Suddenly, my little act of hydrological rebellion had an environmental halo. Neighbors who had previously been cowed into silence by Brenda's tyranny started stopping by, ostensibly to admire the creek, but really to offer quiet words of support and share their own stories of Brenda's overreach. Old Mrs. Henderson, whose prize-winning petunias had once been declared non-compliant flora, brought over a plate of cookies. The Garcias, who had been fined for their children's brightly colored chalk drawings on their own driveway, unauthorized sidewalk art, offered to help me plant more native ferns along the bank. A subtle shift was occurring. Brenda's authority, built on fear and intimidation, was eroding as quickly as the soil around her gazebo posts. She became more isolated, her pronouncements more shrill and desperate. She accused me, at one HOA meeting, which fewer and fewer people were attending, of biological terrorism and weaponizing fish. This was met with mostly stunned silence, punctuated by a few poorly suppressed snickers. Leo, ever the agent provocateur, had started a tongue-in-cheek Friends of the Gazebo Creek Trout Facebook page, posting updates on the trout's well-being and educational facts about riparian ecosystems, often with thinly veiled references to local despots. He even designed a t-shirt with a picture of a feisty-looking trout and the slogan, "Make gazebos damp again." He claimed sales were brisk. The final showdown, when it came, was almost anticlimactic, yet deeply satisfying. It was the annual HOA budget meeting. Brenda, looking harried and unusually disheveled, her usual crisp demeanor wilted, was trying to push through a massive increase in legal fees, presumably to continue her feudal war against my creek. She also proposed a new special environmental assessment fee to be levied on all homeowners to study and mitigate unforeseen hydrological impacts within the community, a transparent attempt to make everyone else pay for her problem. When she opened the floor for discussion, I stood up. I didn't raise my voice. I simply presented the facts, the legality of my actions, the official protected status of the creek, the environmental benefits it provided. I then calmly read aloud excerpts from Mr. Abernathy's letters, highlighting the baselessness of Brenda's legal threats. I followed this with a concise summary of the fines Brenda had levied against me and several other residents, questioning the selective enforcement and the disproportionate nature of the penalties for minor, often non-existent, infractions. This isn't about mosquito control, or property values, or community standards, I said, my voice quiet but carrying in the suddenly silent room. This has always been about one person's insatiable need for control, a need that has led to harassment, wasted community funds, and an attempt to weaponize our own bylaws against us. I then looked directly at Brenda. Your gazebo is damp, Brenda, because you chose to build it on low-lying ground next to a natural watercourse. Your roses are suffering because you prioritized aesthetics over understanding the land. You picked a fight with a puddle, and in doing so, you inadvertently helped create a thriving, protected ecosystem. Perhaps there's a lesson in that. For a moment, there was absolute silence. Then Mr. Miller, he of the shutter dispute, stood up. I move for a vote of no confidence in President Thorne, he said, his voice firm. Mrs. Garcia seconded it. Brenda sputtered, trying to rule it out of order, but the tide had turned. Hands went up, one by one. Even Agnes, the timid retiree, raised a shaky hand. The vote was overwhelmingly against her. Brenda Thorne, HOA president, was deposed by a coalition of disgruntled homeowners and a small, determined trout stream. She didn't resign gracefully. She stormed out, vowing lawsuits and retribution, but her power was broken. The air in the room felt instantly lighter. In the aftermath, a new, far more reasonable HOA board was elected. The absurd fines were rescinded. A sense of neighborly common sense began to return to Pleasant Valley. Leo naturally declared it a victory for the forces of ecological justice and sensible lawn care. Spring arrived, and the creek was a thing of beauty. Sunlight filtered through the new leaves, dappling the clear water as it chuckled over stones. The trout, fatter and more numerous, darted in the cool shadows. My grandfather's drainage ditch, the original casus belli, now fed cleanly into this vibrant little waterway, performing its duty as intended. Brenda's gazebo remained, a monument to her folly. It listed slightly to one side now, the ground beneath it permanently saturated. The once vibrant roses were a straggly, mildewed mess. Occasionally, I'd see her staring at the creek from her kitchen window, her expression a mixture of impotent rage and bewilderment. One afternoon, I was down by the creek, ostensibly checking for debris, but mostly just enjoying the peace, when a small, brightly colored ball belonging to the Miller kids bounced across my lawn and into the water near her property line. Brenda was in her yard. She saw the ball. She looked at the water, then at me. To retrieve it, she'd have to get her feet wet. And technically, since the creek was now a protected fishery, she might even be seen as disturbing the habitat if she waded in clumsily. The state had even sent out informational brochures about respecting trout streams, which Leo had gleefully distributed. I saw the calculation in her eyes. The humiliation. She turned and went back inside. Later, I saw Mr. Miller, armed with a long-handled net, carefully retrieve the ball, giving me a thumbs up. I learned that spring that the state required a fishing license to take trout from any designated fishery. I bought one, though I had no intention of fishing my little creek. It was more of a symbolic gesture. One evening, Sarah and I were sitting on the porch. The porch light, a new one I'd installed, cast a warm glow. It wasn't just a light, it was a beacon of reclaimed territory. The air was filled with the sound of crickets and the gentle murmur of the creek, my grandfather's legacy, now a sanctuary for wild things. You know, Sarah said, leaning her head on my shoulder, for a while there, I thought she was going to drive us out. I looked out at the peaceful darkness, the sound of the water a constant, soothing presence. She picked the wrong fight, with the wrong piece of land. Some places, some legacies, they have their own way of fighting back. And sometimes, all it takes is a slight change in the current, 20 feet to the left, to bring about a deluge of justice. You wouldn't think a drainage dispute could end with a certified trout habitat and a dethroned HOA queen, but as my grandfather used to say, water always finds its level. And sometimes, it carves a path you never expected.